Hello, everybody. And today, I'm going to introduce you to how to destroy a community. Introduction lesson. My name is Aubrey Sanders. As we just discussed, I'm with Auburn University. I am a senior research fellow with the Environmental Design Program. And today, we need to discuss what makes a great city. So a raise of hands, let me know something that you look for when you're choosing where to live.
Good public transit.
Public transit.
Green spaces.
Green spaces. Wonderful. Anything else? I'm sure others. Yeah.
Education.
Education. Huge, right?
Entertainment.
Entertainment. Work opportunities, right? All of these are examples of social infrastructure. The things that bring us all together to educate ourselves, to make these social connections with one another, to build economic opportunities. We were going to be applying this to the Montgomery Peacock Tract today. The Montgomery Peacock Tract is located in the state of Alabama, in the United States of America. Montgomery is the state capital, located in the sort of south central side of the state. And Montgomery Tract is interesting in that it is the birthplace of the civil rights movement in the United States. We see numerous high importance civil rights movements happen in this neighborhood in particular. Rosa Parks, leader of the Montgomery bus boycott against segregation on public transport, lived in this neighborhood. We saw the Mount Zion AME Church is where Martin Luther King met with NAACP to found the civil rights movement in Montgomery. We also see that the church was the stopping point, the last stopping point before heading to the Capitol for the Selma to Montgomery March against voting rights. At the same time, we have this gentleman here, Mr. Sam Engelhardt. He was not a very kind gentleman. He was a white segregationist. He was also happened to be the head of the Highway Transportation Department for the state of Alabama. Originally, the highways were supposed to go around the city, but Engelhardt saw an opportunity to quell all of the civil rights movements that were happening in his city that he saw as somehow, not correct in some way. He was presented with an enormous opportunity, unfortunately. The Peacock Tract is a largely African-American neighborhood. These darker colors here indicating a higher concentration of African-Americans. For roughly 20 years up to this point, the city had been undergoing a process called redlining, where the federal government backed the Homeowners Loan Corporation to create maps that dictated where you could get a mortgage or a business loan. If they were red, that means that you were ineligible to receive these loans. We see that it was the African Americans that were shut out from buying homes and starting businesses. As a result, the land values significantly less than what they would have been otherwise. If you're trying to build a highway, you have a perfect ingredient here. Instead of going around the city as was planned by the federal government, Engelhardt directed the highway to go directly through the center of the city. As a result, he succeeded in shutting down and dismantling many of the important civil rights monuments in the site. We will take a closer look at the Peacock Tract to understand this. How did it happen? This is our study area here, a slightly smaller area than the Peacock Tract, but largely contains the entire tract. In 1953, it was the center of African American culture and commerce in the Montgomery area. When Engelhardt redirected the highway, he had an enormous area here that had to be demolished. Firstly, they had to acquire the property in order to build the highway. How did they do this? Firstly, they made it illegal to own a home that wasn't connected to the public water supply. Once citizens asked to be connected to the public water supply, they denied that request. Therefore, de facto demolition ensued. Additionally, those who did have water supply connections were given a fair market value for their homes at the time, which we will remember here was significantly lower than what it otherwise would have been, correct? So once the highways come in, we see an enormous change in the physical form of the city in this neighborhood here. By 2022, much of the building stock had been destroyed. Much of the connections between roads, which means that people couldn't get to businesses and such as easy as before, as well as other physical manifestations of this. The Peacock Tract, let me use a pointer here, perhaps. Okay, the Peacock Tract occupies this area in blue in Montgomery. This is a section that goes right through the city, so we can sort of get an idea of what's happening here. And a tremendous amount was destroyed and created physical barriers in the city, as we discussed, as well as other externalities to highways, such as extremely high noise pollution. This was mapped by our research here, showing in 2022 the amount of sound that was produced by the highway, creating this physical barrier with sound. We're going to listen to an anecdote by the longtime resident of the Peacock Tract. And here we will observe the residents continuously talked about how important social infrastructure was to the community and how devastating it was when it was taken out.
Protests. I didn't witness any outward objection, but I could see the problem that it created, because it just so I think I'm gonna do it. Off the top of my head, I'll say that was at least 20 bits, and the 2 block here at least 20. Which are talking from Rosa Parks now, Big Avenue to Oak Street.
So we hear how important social infrastructure was indeed. Today, the neighborhood is largely seen as unsafe, and yet the residents are still blamed for this. It's high unemployment rates, and yet the residents are still blamed for this. We see derelict housing, everything is crumbling, the infrastructure is crumbling around them, and they are blamed for this. The residents themselves are blamed, even though they had no opportunities to voice their opinions on the highway redevelopment. There are 2 essential issues that presented here. How is it that they could be blamed for this? It cannot be true. You cannot have it such that the residents have no opportunity to voice their opinions, and yet somehow they are also to blame. This is a logical fallacy. Secondly, another issue ensues here. How did the destruction of a fraction of the building stock in the neighborhood lead to a complete collapse of its economy? Just a fraction. For social infrastructure, 22% of the social infrastructure was demolished for the highway, and yet 58% left afterwards. A significant similar thing happens for housing. This is the power of losing social infrastructure, and this is how you destroy a community. There are 3 very important considerations for social infrastructure. The first is that it benefits from what's called economies of agglomeration, which is just a fancy way of saying that the closer that they are together and the more there are, the better the social value that it can create. The second one is that social benefits are also dependent on how costly it is to go from your home to social infrastructure. We recall that when the highways came through, it demolished many of the streets that existed beforehand. And thus, it became extremely more expensive to go from one place to another across the highway if you lived in the Peacock Tract. The third is that the quality of the environment dictates how much social infrastructure can produce. If it's a noisy environment, people are less willing to spend their time and money in that place. Let's observe by mapping out where all of this social infrastructure was what types of social infrastructure were they? So what kinds of goods and services did they produce? And how concentrated were they? How dense were they when they clustered together? We see in 1953 that there are 4 main concentrations in the neighborhood, all located towards the north here. We can see with these sort of hot spots that are created here. When the highway development came through, it planned to go and demolish one of the hotspots, one of the 4 hotspots, and presumably because it was too costly to buy up the rest of the businesses of the land that they occupied, and it was far cheaper to buy up housing that was at the time not in great condition, and instead go sort of and sever them apart from one another, right? And yet the consequence was the exact same as if they had simply demolished the social infrastructure to begin with. Between 1964 and 2022, if we observe what happens in those 3 remaining quadrants, we see that after many years and the types of conditions that they had to endure after the highways developed, a tremendous amount of social infrastructure was lost. It vacated, it left. It was no longer possible to do business in these areas. And so we see here that the Peacock Tract relied heavily on the agglomeration economies of social infrastructure, the benefits that it produced. It relied on all of the goods and services that those social infrastructure allowed the community to consume. As a result, only a fraction had to be demolished in order to cause the entire neighborhood to soon be vacated afterwards. If you see here, one social infrastructure unit demolished caused a little over 3 additional social infrastructure units that were relying on each other to disperse. The same thing happens even more traumatically for housing. All of these houses that were relying on this business or this school or this park being open to be located there soon left thereafter. And so we see over time a tremendous decrease in the number of social infrastructure in an exponential fashion. Additionally, we see the diversity of goods and services that these social infrastructures that were remaining is significantly being decreased. There's no longer the same amount of variety to go and buy or to go and socialize with one another. A similar thing happens with housing as well. The demolition of one housing unit caused roughly 3 other housing units to also move out. Those social connections that those people living together created was severed, and now it was no longer worth living there for those residents. Similarly, for every 5 housing units that were demolished, of the over 600 housing units that were total demolished, one social infrastructure lost all their customers and soon vacated. And we see that housing has decreased, the supply of housing has decreased over time here. In conclusion, Engelhardt was unfortunately highly successful in what he did. And we have still blamed the residents somehow. But yet we see that the total collapse of social infrastructure is the real cause of this. And it wasn't to blame from the residents. The residents had no say in this. Instead, when the highway came through, it pushed out everyone, businesses, schools, parks, everything was left to fend for itself. And so if you want to know how to destroy a community, this is it. Get rid of the social infrastructure. But if you want to bring it back, it's time to bring social infrastructure back into the Peacock Tract. And yet we have to be careful from threats such as gentrification and the displacement of future people and future residents. And now I open the floor to any questions or concerns.